Kursk was supposed to be Germany's comeback. After Stalingrad, Hitler needed one clean victory to stop the bleeding, restore confidence, and break Soviet strength in the east. Instead, the delay meant to strengthen Operation Citadel did the opposite. It gave the Red Army time to build a battlefield designed to absorb, slow, and grind down the attack. By the time German armor moved on July 5, 1943, the trap was already waiting. And within days, the offensive that was meant to reset the war became the moment Germany lost the initiative for good on the Eastern Front. By summer 1943, the Eastern Front had reached a dangerous pause. Stalingrad had shattered Germany's aura of invincibility, but the Wehrmacht was still powerful enough to attempt another major blow. The front around Kursk formed a huge Soviet salient, an exposed bulge projecting into German lines. For Berlin, it looked like an opportunity: strike from north and south, cut the bulge off, destroy Soviet forces inside, shorten the front, and regain the initiative. For Moscow, it looked like the obvious place Germany would try next. That shared understanding is what made Kursk so deadly. The stakes were larger than the map. Hitler needed a visible victory after Stalingrad to stabilize morale and reassure allies that Germany still controlled the pace of the war. German commanders also wanted a more manageable front line because manpower and equipment shortages were already severe. The Tank Museum notes that by March 1943 German forces in the east were hundreds of thousands below strength and had only about 600 operational tanks, which helps explain why a limited offensive at Kursk looked attractive compared with broader options. Operation Citadel was agreed in principle in March, but timing became the fatal argument. The attack was initially set much earlier, then repeatedly postponed. German leadership wanted more supplies, more reserves, and newer armor, especially Panthers, to arrive before committing. On paper, delay looked rational: wait, concentrate, strike harder. In practice, every week of delay gave the Soviets exactly what they needed most: time. And here's the twist that shapes the entire battle: Kursk was not a surprise offensive. Soviet command had identified the likely target area early, through both logic and intelligence reporting. Instead of attacking first, they chose a defense in-depth strategy: let the German spearheads hit prepared belts, bleed them, then counterattack with reserves. That decision is the core of the Kursk story: not just superior numbers, but a deliberate plan to trade space and time for operational collapse of the enemy offensive. The Soviet preparation was massive. Public history summaries differ on exact totals, but they align on the essentials. The Red Army concentrated around 1.9 million men, roughly 5,000 tanks, and enormous artillery strength in and around the salient, with additional reserves behind the front. German forces committed roughly 780,000 to 900,000 men and around 2,400 to 2,700 tanks and assault guns, with major air support, in a bid to break through on two axes before Soviet reserves could fully intervene. The scale alone guaranteed that once the fighting started, it would be more than a single tank clash. It would be a campaign of attrition, engineering, artillery, and command decisions. The German plan was straightforward in concept and brutal in execution. In the north, Walter Model's 9th Army would drive south. In the south, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, supported by Army Detachment Kempf, would drive north. The two pincers would meet east of Kursk and seal the salient. But the simplicity of the map hid the real problem. Both spearheads had to punch through heavily fortified, deeply layered defenses under constant artillery fire and while losing momentum to mines, obstacles, and local counterattacks. This is where Soviet preparation mattered more than headline numbers. A U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute report on Soviet defensive tactics at Kursk describes a dense, echelon system: rifle corps and divisions deployed in depth, anti-tank strongpoints spread through the defensive zone, trench networks, engineer obstacles, and reserves positioned for local counterblows. The report emphasizes how Soviet defenses were now more integrated than earlier in the war, with infantry, artillery, engineers, and armor tied together instead of operating as separate pieces. In other words, the Germans were not attacking a line. They were attacking a system. Germany delayed Citadel to make the offensive stronger, But those delays allowed the Soviets to build exactly the kind of battlefield that neutralized Germany's best strengths. The question was no longer whether the Germans could attack. It was whether they could keep enough combat power intact to exploit any breakthrough after the first belts were smashed. By early July, the battlefield was ready in the worst possible way. Tank Museum and other summaries describe successive Soviet defensive belts packed with minefields, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire, and gun positions, with huge mine totals in both the northern and southern sectors. Soviet commanders also held major reserves behind the front. German commanders, meanwhile, concentrated some of their best armored formations and new vehicles for the assault, but many of those war-winning systems were entering battle under real combat conditions for the first time, with reliability issues still unresolved. When the battle began on July 5th, the opening already hinted at how the operation would unfold. Accounts note Soviet artillery fired shortly before the German main assault, but the barrage did not stop the attack. The Germans still moved forward. The real issue was not whether Citadel would launch, it was what the first days would cost. On both axes, German armor and engineers had to clear lanes through mines and obstacles while under fire, and every delay at the front compressed the timetable for the entire operation. Citadel depended on speed. Kursk took speed away. In the north, Model's advance quickly became a grinding fight against prepared positions. World History Encyclopedia's summary, consistent with the broader pattern in other sources, describes Soviet strongpoints, mines, and anti-tank defenses slowing the advance so severely that German units struggled to break beyond the second defensive lines. The German side still inflicted losses, but not at the pace required to create operational collapse. This was the hidden cost of attacking a fortified salient. You could win local engagements and still lose the campaign because the timetable dies first. In the south, Hoth's forces made better progress at first. Some German formations, including elite armored units, pushed through initial defenses and gained ground toward the Aboyan axis. But better progress did not mean free maneuver. The advance remained slow, mine damage mounted, infantry clearance operations consumed time, and Soviet reserves were already moving. The southern pincer looked more dangerous than the northern one, but it was also burning through the very force it needed for the decisive breakthrough. Meanwhile, the technical solution Germany had hoped would tip the odds was failing to deliver clean results. Panthers appeared in strength for the operation, but reports and later summaries repeatedly note mechanical and track problems in their combat debut. Tigers remained powerful, but too few in number to transform the battle by themselves. Ferdinands hit hard, but heavy vehicles committed into mined, obstacle-filled assaults suffered from recovery and mobility problems when disabled. Kursk did not prove German armor was ineffective. It proved that advanced vehicles could not compensate for strategic delay, defensive depth, and a bad operational equation. Rehook. By the end of the first phase, the German offensive still looked dangerous on the map, especially in the south. But the deeper story was now clear. The Germans were spending elite armor to buy yards, while the Soviets were spending prepared defenses to buy time. And time was exactly what the Red Army needed to set the next trap. Mini cliffhanger from Module 2, the battle's most famous moment, Prokhorovka, would become a legend of massed tanks. But the real turning point was bigger than one clash. It was the moment German momentum ran out while Soviet reserves, counteroffensives, and events outside the battlefield all converged at once. Quick recap. Germany launched Operation Citadel to regain the initiative by cutting off the Kursk salient. The delays meant to strengthen the offensive gave the Soviets months to prepare layered defenses, minefields, and reserve forces. By the time German attacks began on July 5th, both pincers were already fighting a battle of attrition, and only the southern advance still had a chance to produce a major breakthrough. What happened next would decide not just Kursk, but who controlled the pace of the war in the east. As the second week of fighting began, the northern German thrust was stalling. Model's forces had suffered heavy losses and had not achieved the penetration needed to make the pincer concept work. Some accounts place his acknowledgement of failure to reach Kursk by around July 9th. Whether measured in miles gained or tanks lost, the key point is operational. The northern arm was no longer driving toward encirclement. It was trying to survive long enough to avoid being overrun when the Soviet counterattack came. In February 1943, the German army in the east looked finished. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces surged across Ukraine, convinced the front was collapsing. Cities fell one after another. Headquarters maps showed arrows moving only west. Yet within weeks, the advance stopped, then reversed. Entire Soviet formations vanished in the winter snow. What happened between Stalingrad and Kursk wasn't a miracle weapon or sudden reinforcements. It was a decision to retreat on purpose and invite the enemy forward. The winter after Stalingrad was supposed to end the war in the east. Soviet armies advanced hundreds of kilometers across southern Russia and Ukraine. German units withdrew in disorder. Fuel shortages, exhausted troops, and shattered command structures made organized defense nearly impossible. The stakes were larger than a single city. If Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper River before spring mud, they could split the German front and isolate army groups south from the rest of the Eastern Front. Losing Ukraine meant losing coal, grain, and industrial centers that still supported German war production. But here's the twist: the German High Command did not agree on how to respond. Adolf Hitler demanded every city be held. Retreat meant weakness. Yet Field Marshal Erich von Manstein saw something different. The Soviet advance was fast, too fast. Tank armies raced forward beyond infantry and supply lines. Fuel trucks lagged behind. Units lost radio contact. Winter storms slowed everything except momentum. Manstein proposed something dangerous: pull back voluntarily. Instead of defending each position, he wanted to abandon ground to stretch the attackers thin. The idea was simple but risky: create a vacuum and let the Red Army fill it faster than it could support itself. And this mattered because speed is only useful when it can be sustained. During January and early February 1943, German units retreated across the Donets Basin. Cities like Kharkov changed hands. Soviet commanders believed they were witnessing total collapse. Reports spoke of victory conditions forming across the front. But here's where the danger grew. The deeper Soviet forces moved west, the more their formations separated. Tank corps outran artillery. Mechanized units outran fuel. Infantry marched days behind armored spearheads. The winter weather froze engines at night and jammed supply roads by day. Manstein waited. He concentrated what remained of his mobile forces. Panzer divisions kept intact rather than scattered. They stayed behind the front, hidden from the main Soviet push. To the advancing armies, resistance looked disorganized. But that was the point. The Soviet plan depended on continuous forward motion. Every kilometer forward increased their confidence. Every kilometer also widened their flanks. And then came the moment the entire plan depended on. The attackers reached the edge of operational exhaustion. Late February. Soviet spearheads approached the Dnieper crossings and prepared to pivot south. Many believed the campaign was entering its final phase. German resistance seemed broken. But here's the problem: they had advanced faster than their logistics. Fuel shortages appeared in reports. Units paused unexpectedly. Coordination weakened. Entire corps operated on assumptions rather than confirmed orders. Manstein had been waiting for exactly this. Instead of defending Kharkov directly, he prepared a counterstroke against the moving flanks behind the advancing armies. The objective wasn't to hold territory, it was to break cohesion. The German panzers moved not toward the strongest point, but toward the weakest connection between Soviet formations. And suddenly, the retreat stopped. Mini cliffhanger. Within days, the hunters became isolated pockets. But the real shock wasn't that Germany attacked again. It was how quickly the front reversed direction. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces advanced rapidly across Ukraine. Manstein deliberately withdrew, allowing their armies to outrun supply lines. By late February 1943, Soviet spearheads were extended, separated, and vulnerable. Now the counterattack began, and everything depended on timing. The German counterstroke started against exposed Soviet flanks rather than the forward spearheads. Panzer divisions struck supply routes, command posts, and supporting formations first. The goal wasn't immediate destruction, It was dislocation. And this changed the battle instantly. Soviet units at the front suddenly lost coordination with neighboring formations. Some continued advancing, unaware that their rear areas were collapsing. Others turned back too late. Instead of one front line, the battlefield fragmented into isolated engagements across the snow-covered steppe. But here's the twist: winter now favored mobility. Frozen ground allowed rapid armored maneuver. German forces moved between separated Soviet armies, encircling them piece by piece. Communications failures multiplied the confusion. Units believed adjacent formations were still present when they were already cut off. By early March, several Soviet mechanized groups faced encirclement. Retreat routes closed faster than they could reorganize. The offensive momentum that drove the winter advance now worked against them, because speed had stretched them beyond support. Manstein shifted the focus again. Instead of continuing west, he pivoted toward Kharkov. The city held symbolic and operational value. Soviet forces occupying it were now exposed on three sides after the counterattacks. German units approached from multiple directions. Street fighting followed, but the decisive factor had already occurred outside the city. The Soviet front line no longer existed as a continuous structure. Kharkov changed hands again in mid-March 1943. The payoff wasn't territorial alone. The German front stabilized. The Red Army halted its deep winter advance and reorganized along a new defensive line. The campaign bought Germany several critical months to rebuild armored formations. And those months led directly to the next major confrontation, Kursk. But the deeper lesson wasn't about a single victory. Manstein's counterstroke showed operational maneuver could offset numerical inferiority temporarily. It did not reverse the war's direction, but it delayed its outcome. Germany regained balance long enough to prepare one last large offensive. After Kharkov, both sides understood the coming battle would be decisive not because of territory, but because maneuver warfare was becoming harder. Defensive depth, reserves, and logistics would soon dominate the Eastern Front. The winter campaign proved something crucial: speed without structure becomes vulnerability.